the Nordic countries harbor some of the most pristine nature in the world. From the mesmerizing geysers of Iceland to the majestic fjords of Norway, the otherworldly moonscapes of Sweden, the enchanting woodlands of Finland, and the unassuming charm of Denmark's potato fields, the North has a lot to offer. Here, the call of the wild is not just a distant echo, but a true invitation to explore and connect. Welcome to the Nordics, where everyone's right to nature is more than just a privilege. It's a way of life. This is Allemansrätten. Allemansrätten translates directly into every man's right in Swedish. But each of the 5 Nordic countries has its own term that describes a principle that is largely the same. The basic idea of Allemansrätten is that everyone shall have access to the land and that this right cannot be taken away through private ownership. Oftentimes, terms like right to roam or freedom to roam are used to refer to this idea, while the socio-political conversation around it is usually framed in terms of access rights. There are a few countries outside of the Nordics which have established rules for broad access to public and private lands as well. And there is a particular pattern that emerges when you look at the countries in question. Most of them happen to be in the north. For instance, there is a weaker version of a right to roam in the Baltics. But the second most prominent place in Europe for access to nature is arguably Scotland. Here, the right to roam was only enshrined by the 2003 Land Reform Act, which concluded a long-standing debate about access rights in the country. It's worth pointing out, though, that a freedom to roam sounds like a more limited set of rights than every man's right, which has a much more fundamental ring to it. After all, Allemansrätten encompasses far more privileges than just the right to roam around an area. Let's look at Sweden as an example. In Sweden, every person has the right to access, walk, cycle, ride, and ski on any land, with the exception of gardens, a set area around dwellings, such as homes, and land under cultivation. There are also some restrictions in nature reserves and other protected areas. But not only are you allowed to traverse these lands, you can also pick wildflowers, mushrooms, and berries, go swimming, build a fire, and, arguably most importantly, set up camp to stay up to 2 nights in one spot. Allemansrätten does not, however, allow the use of motorized vehicles or hunting. Also, fishing is still largely private, except for the 5 largest lakes of Sweden, where it is always legal. The way it looks to me, the Swedish version of Allemansrätten is the strongest in the Nordics, with Norway closely behind. Finland and Iceland follow, and Denmark, the southernmost of the Nordics, has a relatively restricted right to roam. For example, rules relating to making a fire are more restrictive in Finland, and Denmark prohibits entering many private properties. Allemansrätten is a guaranteed right in the Swedish constitution. However, there is only limited legislation that expands on the exact limitations of this right. So how does the right actually exist? One way to visualize this is by placing Allemansrätten in the legal space that exists between economic interests, privacy, and nature preservation. Let's zoom into this a bit. First of all, Allemansrätten shall not seriously infringe on the economic interests of private landowners. For example, it is not allowed to enter a wheat field and harvest the crop. Next, nobody's privacy may be infringed upon. The legal principle of hemfridszon, or zone of privacy, establishes a perimeter around the immediate vicinity of a residence of up to 70 meters, which one should avoid. Finally, the preservation of nature is central. You cannot, for example, cut down healthy trees to build a fort or some sort of permanent shelter. You might notice that these stipulations can feel a bit vague. With few actual laws on the books about what Allemansrätten does and does not allow, there could be quite a bit of disagreement about the use of private property. And indeed, there absolutely are lawsuits that occur over access to private property. But in general, there are relatively few disputes about access rights in Sweden. The right to roam in the Nordics works as well as it does because of one crucial trait, and that is social trust. The central pillar of the right to roam in Sweden is the maxim, "Do not disturb, do not destroy." Think about all the layers of trust that are given to Outdoorspeople in this statement. Not only are they tasked with obeying these stipulations, they are also expected to understand what they mean, to use their best judgment and respect the three boundaries of property rights, privacy, and preservation, even when no one else is watching. A similar mentality can be found in a debate about the right to pick wild berries in Finland from all the way back in 1888. One representative, Helfors, from the clergy, stated even back then, "I think that our people has such a sense of justice that it will not take anything from another's land if the landowner prohibits him of doing so." But the social trust I am referring to isn't just rooted in the past or merely theoretical. It's actually backed up by data. According to the most recent data from Eurostat, the 5 Nordic countries take up the top 6 spots in the category Trust in Others. Only the Netherlands interrupts this streak by claiming 5th place. And just as an aside, the Netherlands also preaches a culture of acting responsibly towards each other. Doe normaal. With this social trust in their tool belt, the cultural assumptions about private property change. In the Anglo-Saxon context, private property has traditionally been well defined and protected extensively. For example, 38 US states have stand-your-ground laws. Most of these laws allow homeowners to use deadly force when somebody enters their property. Property rights are also protected in Sweden, but the academic Reza Mortazavi describes access rights in Sweden as a cooperative game. In a nutshell, owning property gives you some rights over the land, but it doesn't grant the owner the right to prevent the rest of society to enjoy the land themselves. In the same way, by respecting the privacy of the owner and the economic potential of the land, Outdoorspeople have a responsibility to ensure that property ownership remains a sensible undertaking. The two sides are bound to this agreement primarily not through the law, but through a shared understanding of how society should function. There are 2 narratives around the concept of Allemansrätten and where it came from. The first, and most commonly referenced story, describes Allemansrätten as a cultural historical tradition that has existed in the Nordics for centuries, if not millennia. In its very early origins, some have pointed out that the vast amount of space in the northern parts of these countries, as well as the unforgiving weather conditions for most of the year, have pushed local populations to develop a strong bond with their environment. One that relies on a symbiosis of humans and nature. Additionally, there are certain natural phenomena that up until a couple of decades ago only a handful of humans would ever experience. This includes, for example, the aurora borealis, also known as Northern Lights, a spectacle that is central to Norse mythology. According to one version, they represent Bifrost, a burning rainbow bridge between Midgård, or Earth, and Åsgård, the realm of the gods. Another story suggests that the light was being reflected from the shields of the Valkyrie, the angels of death, who led fallen warriors to Valhalla. All of this feeds into the narrative that Allemansrätten is merely a natural result of the relationship that the Nordic people have always had with nature. The competing narrative, and one that seems to be favored by some academics, is that Allemansrätten is based on much more practical reasons. It's worth noting, for example, that the term Allemansrätten only appeared in a Swedish water law from 1899, just over 100 years ago. And in the late 1880s, a well-documented and extensive debate about the legality of wildberry picking in Finland that I referred to earlier shows that the difficulty of actually enforcing property rights in the vast Finnish countryside, as well as the reliance of peasants on the sale of the berries they pick to avoid poverty, led to Finland adopting liberal access rights. In this version, Allemansrätten is merely a compromise to uphold the social order. In my view, the truth probably lies somewhere in between these two narratives. The cultural reliance on the land likely shaped the political expectations for access rights. The oldest preserved book written in Swedish, a legal code called Västgötalagen, states even in the 13th century that if a man wants to build a mill, he may not build it so that another man's ground is damaged, nor his field or meadow, nor public roads, nor the neighbor's sidewalk. This ancient text will undoubtedly have had an effect on the idea of land ownership. Why is Allemansrätten important? After all, countries like Germany, Australia, and Ireland offer a wealth of natural beauty in national parks and countless forests. Well, if we compare the rule sets of, say, Germany and Sweden, we can actually find an important similarity between the two. In both countries, you can actually enter onto and traverse private lands for recreational purposes. The German Betretungsrecht allows for this by limiting the constitutional right to property as stated in Article 14 of the Grundgesetz. But in the case of Germany, this is where the right to nature pretty much ends. Foraging, for example, is not included in this law, and you cannot pick wild berries or mushrooms on private lands. Also, making a fire is prohibited in forest and nature reserves, which are obviously the places where you'd want to make a fire, and can result in fines of up to 5,000 euros. Most importantly, however, Germany and most other countries in Europe and the world does not allow wild camping. In my view, this difference fundamentally changes not only the ability to enjoy nature, but indeed a people's relationship to nature itself. Let me show you what I mean. There seems to be a general assumption by governments and perhaps even societies that the different tiers of access to nature exist on a linear scale. The first tier ensures that people can walk through public forests or nature reserves. This exists almost everywhere. The second tier could extend this right to some private lands, like the Betretungsrecht in Germany. Now the third tier could include the ability to forage for mushrooms, berries, twigs and nuts, as well as the right to make a fire. And the fourth tier might allow outdoors people to pitch a tent in the wild and spend the night not on a campground, but in nature, like actual nature. What I want to draw attention to is that I think that this is a misleading way to think about humans' relationship to nature. I believe that each tier actually provides exponential utility gains. The difference between being able to travel through a forest on the one hand and to build a fire from fallen leaves and twigs, cooking the mushrooms that you had to find, identify, and then pick on the other, significantly deepens your experience. And having the ability to remain in a space for 1 or even 2 nights, setting up camp, familiarizing yourself with your immediate environment, and sleeping under the stars with nothing but wilderness around you for miles and miles is a whole different experience than a 4-hour traverse hike that ends back at your home or an expensive hotel. I know this because last year I actually made use of Allemansrätten in Sweden myself. Some of my friends and I went hiking in the beautiful Jämtland region and slept in tents every night. There were cold nights, even in August, when our sleeping bags were all that separated us from actual death.
Lovely.
There were stormy nights when the sound of wind gusts smashing into our tents confronted us with the immense power of the natural world. But there were also campfires, ridiculous and failed attempts at finding edible mushrooms, and even some fishing that went absolutely nowhere that shaped our appreciation for the region, the country, the world, and importantly, our place within it. And this leads me to my central question. How can we expect people to care about the environment if they never even get to enjoy it? This is important. First of all, we should distinguish between the environment and the climate. Taking care of the environment is largely related to the proper engagement with your immediate surroundings, wherever you are. This means not littering, not cutting down individual healthy trees, not diverging the path of a river, and so on. But the prominent political and social conversation almost never revolves around this, but around climate change. Climate change has to do primarily with the release of various greenhouse gases and the effect this has on global temperature. But this process is much less tangible. You cannot see CO2. You can't truly feel the difference of 1 degree in temperature. Climate change is an important problem, but we have long neglected the role of our relationship to the environment as an integral part of this issue. The legendary ecologist Aldo Leopold wrote about this back in the 40s. We abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. In 2004, this idea was picked up by 2 researchers, Meyer and France, who developed the connectedness to nature scale. In the author's own words, one key takeaway was that the studies support Leopold's contention that connectedness to nature leads to concern for nature, as the connectedness to nature scale has also been shown to relate to a biospheric value orientation, ecological behavior, anti-consumerism, perspective-taking, and identity as an environmentalist. In the context of Allemansrätten, the data is pretty much in line with this. A 2022 ranking of Europe's most sustainable shoppers, for example, has 3 Nordic countries, Finland, Denmark, and Sweden, within the top 5 spots. And the 2 non-Nordic countries in here, Austria and Slovenia, have fairly permissive access laws when compared to other European countries. In Austria, for example, it is sometimes allowed to set up camp for one night. Also, this ranking does not seem to just be a measure of wealth either, because in the bottom 5 countries, Ireland and Luxembourg are listed, the countries with the 2 highest GDPs in Europe. It seems as though the more freedom a country allows in making use of its nature, the more its people care about the environment and about the climate. Now, what are we going to do with this information? My answer is, unsurprisingly, that governments around the world should strive to implement more access rights to nature. This would be a great opportunity to let young and old build a more foundational relationship to their home, a potential way to increase social trust, and a bold step towards more holistic climate policy. At the same time, the realities of the Nordics are simply different from those in other countries. Social trust is undoubtedly one of the highest in the world. The local people have learned how to conduct themselves in nature from a young age. The vastness of Nordic nature provides enough space for everyone to visit. Therefore, my recommendation isn't to just transplant Allemansrätten flat out, but to work up to a similar system. And there are countless ways to go about this. A country could start with one area, perhaps a medium-sized forest, and learn from this experience before expanding the right. Another option would be to let people take a test that will allow them to make fires and wild camp, in the same way that fishing licenses exist. How this subject isn't near the top of the agenda of the green parties of this world is honestly confusing to me. Besides the connectedness to nature scale, there is tons of other research that establishes a clear link between nature enjoyment and climate protection. Some of it is down in the video description, along with my other sources. Perhaps with this video I was able to reach a few people and simply draw their attention to the existence of Allemansrätten. And maybe this little thought seed can develop into something meaningful in the future. For now, thank you for all the time you've spent watching this video. As I've said before, if you want to support, well, me, you can subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and send this video to a friend. If you've seen my other videos, you will have realized by now that there really is no discernible theme to my videos. I just discuss what I'm passionate about at any given time. I will, however, upload a video soon that's going to explain what my vision for this channel is, so make sure you're subscribed to the Library of Everything. Thanks again, and goodbye.